Imagine you're a chef in a busy restaurant, and you need to prepare meals for a large number of guests. You can't just cook one meal at a time, you need to cook multiple meals simultaneously. This is similar to managing infrastructure in the cloud, where you need to create multiple resources, such as virtual machines or databases, quickly and efficiently. Terraform for Loops and dynamic blocks are like your kitchen assistants, helping you automate and streamline your infrastructure deployment process. In this tutorial, we'll explore how to use Terraform for Loops and dynamic blocks to simplify your infrastructure management. By the end of this tutorial, you'll be able to automate your infrastructure deployment and management tasks with ease. Terraform for Loops are like a recipe book that allows you to create multiple resources, such as virtual machines or databases, using a single template. This is similar to a factory production line, where you can produce multiple products using the same machine. Dynamic blocks, on the other hand, are like a modular kitchen, where you can add or remove modules, such as a toaster or a blender, as needed. This allows you to create complex infrastructure configurations using simple, reusable blocks. Terraform for Loops and dynamic blocks are essential tools for managing infrastructure in the cloud, as they allow you to automate and streamline your deployment process. By using Terraform for Loops and dynamic blocks, you can create multiple resources quickly and efficiently, and manage complex infrastructure configurations with ease. Let's take a look at a simple architecture diagram that demonstrates how Terraform for Loops and dynamic blocks work. In this diagram, we have a Terraform configuration file that uses a for loop to create multiple virtual machines. The for loop is like a conveyor belt that creates multiple virtual machines using the same template. We also have a dynamic block that creates a load balancer and attaches it to the virtual machines. The dynamic block is like a modular kitchen that adds or removes modules, such as a load balancer, as needed. The Terraform configuration file is like a recipe book that contains the instructions for creating the infrastructure. The Terraform state file is like an inventory management system that keeps track of the resources created. To follow along with this tutorial, you'll need to have Terraform installed on your machine. Terraform is like a kitchen appliance that helps you automate and streamline your infrastructure deployment process. You'll also need to have a basic understanding of infrastructure as code concepts, such as resources and modules. Don't worry if you're new to Terraform or infrastructure as code, we'll cover the basics as we go along. So, when should you use Terraform for Loops and dynamic blocks? The answer depends on your specific use case. If you need to create multiple resources, such as virtual machines or databases, using a single template, then Terraform for Loops are the way to go. On the other hand, if you need to create complex infrastructure configurations using simple, reusable blocks, then dynamic blocks are the better choice. Here's a comparison table that summarizes the key differences between Terraform for Loops and dynamic blocks. In this step, we'll create a Terraform configuration file that uses a for loop to create multiple virtual machines. This is like creating a recipe book that contains the instructions for creating the virtual machines. We'll use the Terraform template syntax to define the virtual machines and the for loop to create multiple instances. Let's take a look at the code and see how it works. In this step, we'll apply the Terraform configuration to create the virtual machines. This is like following the recipe book to create the meals. We'll use the Terraform apply command to create the resources and the Terraform state file to keep track of the resources created. Let's take a look at the code and see how it works. Here's a flowchart that summarizes the steps involved in using Terraform for Loops and dynamic blocks. We start by creating a Terraform configuration file that defines the resources we want to create. We then use the Terraform init command to initialize the Terraform working directory. Next, we use the Terraform apply command to create the resources. Finally, we use the Terraform state file to keep track of the resources created. To verify that the resources have been created successfully, we can use the Terraform console to check the status of the resources. We can use the Terraform show command to display the details of the resources created. Let's take a look at the output and see what we can learn. When working with Terraform for Loops and dynamic blocks, you may encounter some common issues. One common issue is that the Terraform configuration file may not be formatted correctly, which can cause errors when applying the configuration. Another common issue is that the Terraform state file may become out of sync with the actual resources created, which can cause problems when trying to manage the resources. Let's take a look at some common issues and how to troubleshoot them. In this tutorial, we learned how to use Terraform for loops and dynamic blocks to simplify our infrastructure management. We created a Terraform configuration file that used a for loop to create multiple virtual machines and a dynamic block to create a load balancer. We applied the Terraform configuration and verified that the resources were created successfully. By using Terraform for loops and dynamic blocks, we can automate and streamline our infrastructure deployment process, making it easier to manage complex infrastructure configurations. Subscribe for daily in-depth DevOps tutorials explained in simple terms.